Today, we're going to be interviewing a very well known author, Jessie Singer, who authored the book There Are No Accidents: The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster, Who Profits and Who Pays the Price. This is an interesting book. I came to meet Jessie by way of Ralph Nader, who's a mutual friend, and would like to ask you some questions about your book. Welcome, Jessie Singer.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, tell me how you came up with the title.
The title was hard. For a long time, it was called Accidental America, which in hindsight is so corny. The title actually, came from a conversation with my editor, and the book was done. It was on its way to the door. And it was just something that we kept saying in conversation as we were talking about the book. And, I'd like to give him credit. My editor, Eamon Dolan, said, wait, is that a title? I think that's the title. Do you think that's the title? And I was like, oh, it is the title. Which was it was a very nice moment of a
it's a powerful statement. It's a very powerful statement. And you're right. I think most people would agree there are no such things as accidents. We may use that phrase, accident. And I think we misuse the phrase. In fact, in your book, you talk about the word accident, quote unquote, as erroneously implies that injuries occur by chance and cannot be foreseen or prevented. In much of the scientific work, you say, the descriptor accident, quote unquote, is gradually being replaced by more appropriate terms such as unintentional injury, quote unquote, or descriptors of injuries like fractured tibia, or in my world, slip and fall, whereby there's this specification, there's this describing the event, like a motor vehicle accident or motor vehicle collision. Why do you think that is, Jessie? Why are we softening the language? Why are we changing the language?
I mean, I'd like to say that we're only changing the language in the professional world. We're only seeing the excising of the word accident, among injury prevention specialists, people who are focused on these things. And I think that's because, the more evidence we get, the more it becomes inexorably clear that there's nothing random going on when it comes to injury, that these are rather predictable outcomes. But also that the word accident might be causing us a little harm. I mean, it is a tricky word whose definition makes no sense, and that most of us, when we think of it, studies show that when we hear the word accident, we don't think of its dictionary definition, which, let's start with that. So there's two definitions of the word accident, and they contradict. One is a random event, and the other is a harmful event. So at once, an accident is unpredictable, random, but with a predictable outcome, harmful. So from that totally nonsensical jumping off point, we also don't actually pay attention to either of those definitions. One study I found showed that when we hear the word accident, what we think of is not randomness or harm, but unintentional, which really signifies the kind of focus on blame that is at the heart of what we get wrong about accidents. When things go wrong, when someone gets hurt, when there is this sudden injury, we focus on the last person involved. And from that perspective, it seems random. That person made a bad decision. That person, did something that we wouldn't have done. And in that focus on intention, we miss the layered causality, the stacked dangerous conditions that actually lead to opportunities to prevent the harm. And so I think one thing we see in the world of injury prevention is a lot of people being like, wait, no, let's just focus on the opportunities to prevent harm. And if we can talk about injury instead of accident, then we skip this chase to find a person to blame and instead focus on actually harm prevention.
Is this an American phenomenon, the blame game, or is this kind of like the whole world does the same thing? If somebody gets hurt in China or Pakistan, or pick a country, is it the same thing where, it's just random, non-preventable, unpredictable, kind of like, like winning the lottery? Wow, just kind of serendipity.
I looked a little into the language, and it's a bit complicated, but one thing that's true is less agentive languages, like Japanese and Spanish, where the sentence structure doesn't dictate a who in the construction of an accident related sentence, people are less likely to remember the who, which is like a fascinating little bit of trick of language. But when you're talking about actual accidents, about actual harm, it is a uniquely American phenomena. Compared to other wealthy nations, you are much, much more likely to die by accident in the U.S. Than all of our peer countries.
That's surprising. I think most of my viewers are going to really not associate that the way you said it. In other words, we tend to believe we're the safest country in the world, that we have the fewest number of preventable injuries. There's another interesting term. And then if you were to ask the average American, which we have done, just basic information about safety. For example, we'll ask questions like, so, the man on the street interview that we're going to be doing this season. Who is OSHA? What does OSHA stand for? Who in the government is in charge of safety? You just ask basic safety questions, and it always leads to one thing, Jesse. When we ask the question to just an average person, how big of a deal, how important is safety to you? They all will say it's number one. Safety is the most important thing, as in their life, they will say things like, you ask, do you have a fire extinguisher in your home? No. The ones that say yes, you ask them, where is it? I don't know. Is it charged? But you see what I'm getting at. Safety is number one in words only. And accidents happen really is a kind of a knee-jerk response to the failure of I guess, all of us to take safety seriously. And I guess, before I go on, explain a little bit about what motivated you to write this book.
Sure. I think before I do, I wanted to get at something that's interesting about what you're talking about, which I think is the difference between us and countries in Europe and Japan, is that when we ask the average person about safety, they're answering from a basis of personal responsibility. They're saying, I try to be really safe. I make safe decisions. I do good, which is an American obsession with putting the onus and the responsibility on individuals. Where what happens in those other countries where people are far less likely to die in so-called accidents is that the government and corporations are accountable and responsible for safety.
And you're singing my message.
And it starts there.
Yeah, you're right. Accountability. We all talk about, and I hear it all the time, is, I do a lot of work in slip and fall litigation, trip and fall cases. And I can't tell you how often I hear, well, safety is everyone's responsibility. Well, the real question is, well, who's accountable? I mean, it's everybody's job, but when we fail, it's somehow collectively distributed, so there's no one person to blame. But, you mentioned other countries and corporations and just governments in general, but accountability. Where's the accountability? Where does that come in? And I don't mean blame, but to take responsibility. There was a mishap of some type, an oversight, call it whatever you want. Not trying to be a lawyer here and use the word negligence, but somebody did something that ultimately cost somebody else possibly their life, a severe injury. It's that accountability that it seems we're lacking in our country.
One thing, you said you didn't want to talk about blame, but I think it is actually a helpful concept here because we actually love talking about blame, right? And
that's the reason why I don't want to talk about it, because we're always talking about blame. It's always a blame, right?
It's always a blame, but let's talk about it, right? Because blame is a food chain, right? And as soon as we're talking about that food chain, as soon as we're talking about the lowest common denominator on that food chain, the person who slipped, the driver who made a wrong turn. As soon as we talk about that, we've lost the thread. And so what I say is that blame is a food chain. You always have to look at the top. Who is the most powerful actor here? That's where accountability lies. And one thing we see in places that have had a lot of success in reducing so-called accidental injuries is a focus of accountability at the top. And we see that in our own workers' compensation laws, that the massive death tolls in the workplace of the Industrial Revolution, that changed when corporations became accountable for worker injuries, regardless of what the worker had done wrong. But also, if you look to a country like Sweden, which with their Vision Zero program has made huge advancements in reducing fatalities from traffic crashes. The way they've done that is putting the onus for a traffic death, any given traffic death, on traffic engineers, on the designers of the roads. And so what happens there compared to in this country is when someone is killed in a traffic crash, everyone turns to the person who designed the roads and they say, how did that happen? How are you going to prevent that from happening again? In this country, we turn to the driver and we say, you screwed up.
Right.
Here's a summons.
That's interesting. So it's cultural, really. It's just part of what, I guess, what goes into our DNA as a nation versus other countries. Because here we're, as you know, far more litigious. We file a lot of lawsuits, and we can debate this with Ralph Nader regarding that the importance of such. It plays an important role without question. But if you want to solve the problem is reducing injuries, reducing events, incidents, reducing pain, or in corporate speak, reducing costs. Well, the only real way to do that is to be very, open and honest about what's causing these accidents and what concrete actions can be taken immediately by everyone, including the most powerful, because I agree with you. The people at the top of the corporations need to be accountable for their actions, and that trickles down to the bottom. To everybody understands that. But it seems like we're lacking that will. Is that fair to say?
Are we lacking that will, or are those who stand to make the most profit from blaming this problem on individual behavior simply in charge of all the systems? I mean,
Yeah.
I think that we live in a country where corporate power rules the government, and corporate power is not accountable. We've seen eras of this country where we have dramatically reduced the injury toll. Like, it's not cultural. I mean, if you look after the Industrial Revolution, with the advent of workers' compensation and real worker protections and the fighting of unions, we saw a massive decline in worker deaths. After the creation of NHTSA and Ralph Nader's good work to hold automakers to account and to force them to change conditions inside the vehicle, we saw a massive decline in traffic fatality deaths. And simply what's happened since, and largely since Reagan, made an effort to defang our regulatory agencies, but also to dismantle the social safety net, we've seen rising income inequality and unchecked corporate power. And so, people have less ability to protect themselves because they have less money. They're more likely to live in a fire trap apartment or work a dangerous job or drive a really old car because they simply don't have another economically feasible option. But also, regulation has become this public enemy. So that corporations aren't held to account, when they create dangerous products, when they make unsafe floors or put their workers in harm's way. So I don't think it's cultural. I think it's just a product of corporate power, of unchecked corporate power that keeps getting worse.
You bring up a good point about unsafe floors. As you know, our organization, the National Floor Safety Institute, has petitioned the Consumer Product Safety Commission twice on adopting what we thought was a very fair and reasonable process, and that would be to mandate that manufacturers of floors simply test their product's slip resistance and label it so the consumer knows when they go to the marketplace, what am I buying? I mean, you can't tell by looking at a floor how dangerous it is. I mean, it looks pretty, it's shiny, looks great in whatever room, the price is right. But, surprisingly, a very large number of floors right out of the box are unsafe. And so we went to the Consumer Product Safety Commission 2 times with a simple recommendation. Our petition said that the manufacturers of all floors need to test to the National Floor Safety Institute's prescribed test method, which is the most popular, certainly in North America, possibly the world, and then label their products. And we have a standard for that. Jessie, would it surprise you to know that it failed twice? 2 times we petitioned it, 2 times it failed. We're not asking even for regulation. We're asking for information. Does the consumer have a right? And I'll never forget asking this question in front of the CPSC staff. I said, do you believe that the U.S. consumer has a right to know what they're buying? That when they're making a choice for floors, do they have a right to know how slippery that product is or not? And Jessie, they all looked at me and said, well, that's not for us to say. And I thought, well, I understand you're a staff person, you're not setting policy, but it is for you to say. That is your job. I mean, you're the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And if you're not doing your job, then who is? And it was very disheartening. Now, we were talking about this offline. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has yet to even establish or seat commissioners. They have a new chairman and two existing individuals who were past commissioners. So there's not even a full commission. And here we are 2 years into the Biden administration, and we see we don't even have Jessie, we don't even have a commission. The commissioners haven't been seated. And do you think this transcends politics? That was another question I want to ask you. You mentioned corporations. I know there's a lot of corporate money going into politics and on and on and on. You talked about regulations. Ronald Reagan was very big on defanging, as you put it, regulations because of the effect it might have on negative impact on profits for corporations. But where are we today, Jessie? 2022, in the political, God, it seems like everything is political today. Where are we? How is this? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse?
Whew, that's a hard question. I mean, I like you said, the Biden administration 2 years in still hasn't appointed a head of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So I think, Clinton was as anti-regulation president as his predecessors. So I think the aisle has gotten very blurry when it comes to regulation. And on both sides of the aisle, we're seeing, a real proliferation of an anti-regulatory attitude in the name of corporate profits. And, while there are a few shining stars out there, there are some incredibly late baby steps. I think we're seeing, at the US DOT, Pete Buttigieg is pushing forward the first auto safety regulations we've seen in a really long time, mandating automatic emergency braking in vehicles, and hopefully also mandating driver alcohol detection systems, which are like very simple, life-saving technologies that exist and work great. And if you want, you can pay extra money for them right now. So only the rich people are protected. So there's little bits of hope like that. But I mean, currently right now, to stick with transportation, people are fighting tooth and nail to get a similar rating program like you're discussed with flooring put in for vehicles. Because right now, we only rate the safety of our vehicles for people inside the cars. And so you can buy these new SUVs and light trucks that keep getting bigger with taller and taller grills. I'm sure you see them all over Texas, that pose a much larger danger to pedestrians and cyclists. They're much, much, much more likely to kill pedestrians and cyclists, which is one reason that pedestrian and cyclist fatalities are skyrocketing right now. And in Europe and Japan, since the mid-2000s, all vehicles have been tested for this too. So the vehicle's rated on its safety, and that safety includes how likely it is if you get into an impact with a pedestrian, that pedestrian is to die. And since the mid-2000s, at the objection of automakers, NHTSA has resisted testing vehicles for this. And so just like with floors, we don't even know what safe is. We don't even know what safe looks like. And so currently right now, advocates are petitioning NHTSA to include pedestrian and cyclist safety ratings in this.
So again, the consumer's in the dark when it comes to safety. There's certain beliefs that we all hold that, well, the water we drink is safe, right? Is it? Is bottled water safer than tap water? There's a lot of people have a lot of almost religious views when it comes to safety. And again, back to slips and falls, people that slip and fall are almost doubly prejudiced against because the average person thinks, well, this is all fake. See, that's another issue, Jessie, is, well, these people alleging injuries or, all these far left crazy people wanting to regulate and force industry to make all these dramatic changes. Well, this is all about the trial bar. I can't tell you how many times I hear that. It's all about those trial attorneys, funding the Democratic Party. And I sit back and I'm kind of looking at both sides of the spectrum here, and I'm saying, well, I'm involved in a lot of these lawsuits, and let me tell you, I rarely have ever been presented one that's fake, someone trying to make a quick buck. People don't want to get hurt. Okay, they don't. And this nonsense of, they'll get hurt, have a severe, back injury or head injury, but they were just doing it to make money. I mean, it's almost comical. And you also hear this kind of spouted out by the insurance industry, which Ralph speaks a great deal about, where they're less interested in preventing claims, they're more interested in managing their financial investments, and so that leaves the consumer again in the dark, Jessie. And I asked the question before, but what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, I can tell that story. It's not a happy story, but it is how I got here. So in 2006, I was a young journalist, and I was living in New York with my best friend and high school sweetheart, a young man named Eric. He was 22. We both rode bikes everywhere to get around New York City where we lived, and at the time, he was cycling on a separated biking and walking path that runs along the west side of Manhattan, and he died there. He was killed by a driver who mistakenly turned and entered the bike path, and then drove downtown. That driver was drunk and he was speeding, and he went to prison, which was the worst day of my life. And it wasn't an impetus for writing a book. That came 11 years later. 11 years after Eric was killed, another man rented a truck, and he drove the same route on this bike path, except this time this man intentionally turned onto the path. He killed 8 people and severely injured 11 in an act of vehicular terrorism. It was a terrorist attack that followed the exact same route as my best friend's killing. And it was that kind of pushed me to look into it and to ask questions. And I found that other people had been killed before and after Eric on this same path. Now, every time the drivers were different. Some were distracted, some were lost, some were drunk. But every time the story that was told was it was an accident. And so nothing was done about it except maybe pointing a finger at the driver who had made a bad decision or had made a mistake. But nothing was changed about the built environment. The terrorist attack, though, that changed the paradigm. After the terrorist attack, the city and state got together and they made the harm impossible. They barricaded every entrance to the bike path so that bikes and pedestrians could fit through, but cars couldn't. They simply made it impossible. They changed that environment. And for me, it was this disheartening shock about how random injury and accident is this sort of magic realm where we pretend a willful ignorance, so that we can disregard preventable harm, disregard saving lives because there's, someone to blame.
You bring up a point. A good friend of mine, Dr. Mark Faggiano, speaks openly. He's a college professor about empathy. That who really cares to get involved? It's people get hurt, and I'd like not to think about that because it just gets in the way of my worldview of safety. And everybody inherently wants to feel safe. And if you begin to bring yourself to a place where you realize that safety is just kind of fictitious, by the grace of God, we can all, at any time, well, like Eric, get, killed long before your day from something as, predictable as a car coming across the bike lane. But this empathy, this lack of empathy, I should say, where, people have no concern oftentimes, Jessie, when it comes to injury, they don't really want to get involved. You're in the city of New York. You have, as the media portrays, a elevating crime problem, pushing people on railroad tracks and just insanity. And it's almost like you watch the surveillance video, nobody seems to want to get engaged. There will be beatings on the trains and nobody wants to get involved. And it's that empathy. Do you think as you kind of research this book that culturally maybe what separates us and makes such a big difference is the fact that many people don't want to get involved. They really don't want to be in the middle of somebody else's problem. You wrote the book as really, I would go so far to say you're almost a victim of Eric's death. I mean, in many ways, it affected your life forever. I mean, you're the recipient of somebody else's pain and injury that they went through, fatality. And it's because of that you become empathetic. Am I making sense? You're very sympathetic to what happened because Eric was a close friend of yours. But how do you get people to care about other people like that they don't necessarily know?
I mean, I think it's important to note first that the crime wave in New York City isn't really happening and very overblown by the media. But beyond that, I think it's important to note that I actually think people do care about other people. And while my situation drove me to an extreme form of empathy that I think is really important, because I empathize. I do. It's hard, but I empathize with the person who killed Eric. And I think that's where it starts. I think you need to start with understanding that people react to the conditions that they're placed in. And often those conditions are dangerous. Often the design of a road induces mistakes, encourages speeding. Often the conditions of a floor encourage falling. And often the people who are harmed and the people who make mistakes, and I think this is especially true with falling, are already somehow vulnerable. Whether that's economically or by their age or by their race, they're already exposed to more dangerous conditions. And so the most important work we do with these seemingly random accidents is to empathize with people who are harmed and with people who may even, appear to be the bad actor causing harm. And I do think there's a lot of psychological underpinnings that cause us to not want to do that, to not want to consider other people's injury and death. We talk about like the fundamental attribution error, which is the way that we see our own accidents as the product of the environment we were in at the time, and everyone else's accidents as their own personal failing. And we make this fundamental attribution error in the face of all evidence to the contrary. And we do it because it's comforting. It is a form of psychological regaining of control over what seems like an unsafe, random situation. Because if I can say, you screwed up, you were at fault, then suddenly I'm not exposed or at risk for the same random danger, the same series of consequences. It's protective. But until we overcome that blame paradigm and overcome that basic urge, we're going to keep falling for something that really benefits corporations and government, which is the idea that personal responsibility will save us all.
Right.
But I do think it's important to point out, I think people, when they don't empathize, when people pull back from these situations, part of what they're doing is responding to a negligent government. And to a negligent corporate environment that has told them for decades now that the only person responsible for your safety is you. And I think that's the real difference we see in other countries, is that the government is not a bad actor. The government does protect people. The government does give people resources to survive. And that systemic safety from the top down makes individuals empathize. It changes the environment on the ground so that people, first of all, they have the emotional and mental resources to just be like, hey, I can worry about you because I don't have to worry about myself so much because I'm not starving, because I'm not worried about how I'm paying rent. But also because in general, if you can go get healthcare when you fall, and that when you fall, someone's going to worry about whether that floor was actually safe, makes it more likely that you're going to worry about your neighbor when they fall too. That you're not just worried about yourself, that you're not in this constant, triggered state of self-defense.
What do you think, and we kind of talked about this a moment ago, the role of the media. How do they play into this? The perception that the media portrays of safety. We talk about, whatever the safety issue is, crime, you name it. It's like an endless amount of newscasts. But do you think that the media gets it wrong a lot, and that they kind of send this message? I mean, when you mention my comment about crime in New York, that's the perception that I and many people have based on media events. But what role, Jessie, does the media play, or responsibility do they have and better informing our public as to what's really going on in the world of safety and how we as Americans can make our environment safer. I mean, what responsibility, I guess I'm asking, does the media have?
As a former reporter, I have a lot of sympathy for the conditions that reporters work under and the amount of output that they're forced to create in short amounts of time. When it comes down to it, real reporting takes time and resources that most news organizations don't give to reporters. But that said, I also think that the news media loves conflict-driven narratives. And so if we're going to look at an accident, we're going to see from the news media a story of a bad guy and a good guy. That's the story that was told after Eric's death. Eric was a young public school teacher, with his whole life ahead of him, and he was killed by a bad guy drunk driver. And, the real problem with that narrative is that nothing gets solved. Bad guy goes to prison. The conditions remain dangerous. Nothing is systemically fixed. And everyone gets a good dramatic story, good guy, bad guy. Someone loses. Really, in this story, everyone loses. But, it doesn't force the critical thinking that we need to actually look at the layers of risk that can compound in any given situation when we fail to hold all of the players accountable for the ways that we're exposed to danger.
You mentioned the newsroom. Most mainstream media, whether it's print or television, cable, is run by major corporations. And it would only seem logical that the same criticism that we both share of corporations, oftentimes, would kind of bleed over into news media. There's a certain profitability or narrative or whatever you want to call it that might be skewed to kind of promote, if you will, to use the phrase misinformation about safety or misunderstanding. I don't know, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but the average person is being led to believe, Jessie, that there is in fact a good guy and a bad guy, when in fact a lot of times it's just poor design, lack of thinking, consciousness, and playing the blame game. Because after all, everybody's afraid of those lawyers suing them, right? I mean, isn't that really kind of what it's about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point and a difficult one to overcome, because we do like those narratives, and we do like a good story. And we play into the conversation, that's already being had.
Right.
Though I do see a lot of hope in, the rise of not-for-profit media organizations and the stories they're able to tell. Right before the book came out, there was a horrible fire in New York City in the Bronx, and 17 people were killed. I mean, just an awful, awful story. And the first story that came out about this fire was that it was caused by a faulty space heater that someone left on too long, and people who left their doors open when they ran for the fire. But when we started to look into it, what was really going on was that the building was underheated, which is illegal in New York City, which is why people needed space heaters, and that the self-closing doors, which are legally required in New York City, were malfunctioning. And so really this was a story of a negligent corporate landlord and a city that failed to enforce those regulations. And, the basic blame conflict story was the first story that came out, but I really saw, I had this book coming out and I was talking about the fact that Black people in the United States are twice as likely as white people to die in house fires. And why is that? It's not because they're less responsible with matches. No, it's because they live in adverse conditions. They're exposed to more dangerous conditions in the home for reasons of race and economics. But I was able to find a space to tell that story in nonprofit newsrooms, like with The Takeaway on NPR. And so there was a lot more space to tell that. Recently, I did a little mini documentary with a More Perfect Union, which again is another nonprofit newsroom, about the rise in worker injuries in Amazon warehouses and how Amazon keeps telling a story that the workers aren't stretching enough or the workers aren't paying attention. But really what we're talking about is an insane pace of production in Amazon warehouses that's causing an outsized rate of injury. But we were able to tell that more detailed story and give a voice to Amazon workers who were injured and then out of a job, and just, screwed 6 ways to Sunday. And like actually give them a voice because, there are these nonprofit newsrooms that are telling a more detailed story, that are looking at the systemic causes. So I do think there is some hope in there. And I hope that'll trickle up.
I'm sorry. How any feedback on the book? I mean, I've read it. We've distributed here at the Institute many of your books, autographed books. What have you been hearing? What's the feedback you're getting on the book from those who have read it and critiqued it?
It's gotten great coverage. We've seen it everywhere from NBC to the New York Times a few times over now, and the feedback has generally been really quite positive. I mean, I've seen a little bit of there's the occasional economist who wants to know why I'm not doing a cost benefit analysis, and I say that it's unethical to do a cost benefit analysis when one of the costs is human life. But otherwise, it's generally gotten a good reception. I think.
Yeah, no, you're right. I'm smiling because I hear that all the time. Cost benefit relationship. What's the value of a human life? I mean, how do you? I mean, and don't get me wrong. I understand insurance industry professionals do put a value, a dollar amount, on a broken arm, a fractured rib, a amputated finger, and a life. But we're talking about people, and I think that was the point you were about to make. We're talking about people. How do you put a cost on a person's life and the impact that person has on everybody in their life? But at the end of the day, there comes the business model. You kind of hit it on the head. Everything has to come down to money, and that ultimately means that human life has varying degrees of value depending who you're speaking to. For you, the loss of Eric is a lifelong trauma. But, to others, it's, just a person who got, hit riding his bicycle. And there seems to be a certain kind of nonchalantness about it. Certainly in my world, that's the case. Accidental falls are like the fourth leading cause of accidental injury in the country. And, really nothing about it. I mean, OSHA will have 800, 900 pages in their Code of Federal Regulations. And although falls are the leading cause of workplace injury, I think when you go through all of OSHA's 900 pages, you'll find maybe a paragraph about fall prevention. They really don't spend a lot of time on it, even though it's the biggest issue. And so, again, we talk about politics, we talk about media, we talk about just really, the whole problem wrapped up in how our country is very different than others. But I guess to kind of wrap it up, Jessie, where do we go from here? I mean, what's the next step?
Okay. It's a hard question, but it's a good question. Big picture, we need to undo what Reagan did. I hope, it's all on President Biden for this one. We need to revive our regulatory agencies. We need them to have funding and staff and the faith of a government that believes in forcing corporations to protect human life, because that's what regulatory agencies are supposed to do. So we need to revive our regulatory agencies so people are protected, but we also need to rebuild the social safety net so that people can afford to better protect themselves, to buy a safer car, to not take the most dangerous job, to take the safest route to work. But I also think there's a lot we can do on the local level because, and this is what gives me hope. When it comes down to it, accidents are simple. This is not cancer. This is not COVID. We know how to prevent the harm of injury-related death. And there are a million ways to do it if we can retrain our brains away from enforcement and education and, finding someone to blame and towards harm reduction. We can advocate for all these ways to separate fragile human bodies from harm, whether that's ADA accessibility, like ramps and grab bars and safe flooring that reduces the likelihood and the harm of an accidental fall, or advocating for traffic calming on roads and public transit expansions because you're less likely to get into an accident on a bus than you are in your own car. We can push in our own communities for safe injection sites and the distribution of naloxone to prevent the likelihood of an accidental overdose. We can demand that local regulations require fire safety sprinklers and self-closing doors so that the accident of a fire starting isn't a death sentence. And these are all the same thing. These are all ways to say that to err is human, mistakes are inevitable, but the failure to protect people is not. We can throw a pillow between us and our mistakes if we're willing to focus on reducing harm.
You made another excellent point. As I prophesize my former religion regarding slip, trip, and fall prevention, I find that there's a big difference, Jesse, in folks that are living in urban areas versus suburban areas and rural areas. Much of the problems, as you see it, is coming from the viewpoint you have living in a major metropolitan area. So that's your worldview. People outside of a major city really can't relate to that because they don't deal with public transportation. They're either driving a car or they don't have a subway system, for example. Just the variances or the variations between we as a nation based on where we live, urban, suburban, rural. And those priorities become very mixed up because what is a crisis to an individual living in a major urban environment is not even of interest to somebody in the country, and vice versa. What they go through, someone like yourself is like, well, what do I care about combine safety? And that's like farmers, but to them, that's their life. And so I'm looking for that common denominator. Jesse, help me out here. I'm looking for that. What can we find that we all agree that our politicians could be, persuaded to adopt that protects everybody, no matter where you live, no matter what your race is, no matter what your politic is, that we as a country, we as a nation, and frankly, we as a leader in the world need to take action, concrete action to turn the tide, to make it better, to make it safer. How do we get there? That's kind of what I guess I would wrap up this interview with is how do we get to the next step that really brings change to all Americans in the field of safety?
You were talking about rural areas, and I was thinking about hospital closures, which is something you would never think about for your average New Yorker, where there's a hospital on every corner. But it's the reason that people die by accident in rural areas. It is one of the core reasons, which is that transit time to a hospital, as more and more rural hospitals are deciding it's not profitable enough and are being closed, the transit time to the hospital is a factor. And so I think that kind of points to an answer, which is understanding safety, understanding injury-related death, accidents, harm, as a matter of layers, and that we can intervene at so many layers. So we can change the regulations of how combine harvesters are manufactured. We can change the regulations that dictate how workers are allowed to work on those and how much training they need. But we can also change the amount of federal funding that we give to hospitals that force them to stay open in rural areas. So should the worst occur, should that combine, not be properly regulated and that worker be working long, hours and be too tired, that their transit time to the hospital doesn't mean that they're not going to survive those mistakes. And so I think if we can see the idea of accidents as not a matter of personal responsibility, not a matter of one person screwing up, but a matter of exposure to dangerous conditions, and that those exposures are layered, we can start to intervene at a million points of the process, or even just one, and every intervention will trickle out into more safety.
Well, we saw that with the COVID pandemic here in Texas, where many of the rural areas didn't have hospitals because they were closed. And those people that were sick came into the major metropolitan areas and overwhelmed the hospital system in Dallas and Fort Worth and every major city. And it was because of that lack of medical ability or really just availability, I should say, in the rural communities that really forced people who were ill, not by accident, but by illness, to seek medical attention in the bigger cities. And of course, that overloaded the system. And we all know how that kind of ended. But we've been talking with Jessie Singer, author of There Are No Accidents. Any new books on the frontier? Looking to maybe do a sequel?
Not yet, but I do think that the realm to explore coming out of this book is this idea of blame, and our love of blame, and how it disguises so much about, the power that corporations and the government have, the negligence that isn't keeping us safe, and how, whether we're talking about crime or accidents, searching for a bad guy is always chasing us in the wrong direction if what we care about is preventing people from being harmed.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Well, Jessie, thanks for the generous amount of time you gave me today. And I will be eagerly looking for your next book or article. Are you still a journalist? Are you still working at the?
Oh yeah, at least on the side. I tend to only write when I get really angry about something.
That's your motivator, huh? Anger is a good motivator, as long as
it
it's
is.
constructive anger. So, well, thanks again, Jessie, and you're welcome back anytime to pick up this subject. And look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Take care.